Okay. Well, hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And we have our good friend, John Connolly, with us today, longtime friend. We're going to be talking about his brand new book, The Nameless Ones. And this is a copy of the US edition. And we had some UK copies earlier, sold those out. But we got this wonderful bunch of swag that goes with this book, which is pretty cool. We got the Joker card, which will go with each book. I feel a little bit like Vanna White here. And the signed bookmark here. And to top it all off, this super cool book bag. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, very cool.
Really is. What does it say on the back side?
They were on the side of the angels, even if the angels were not entirely sure that this was a positive development. That's great.
How fabulous.
A great quote. So I will go ahead and put a link in the comments field should you wish to purchase one. And I'll also be monitoring on YouTube and Facebook the comments. So if you have questions for John, go ahead and put those in, and Barbara will summon me like magic towards the end of the hour, and I'll be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you so much. Wow, this is so great. An hour with my favorite Irishman. I mean, John and I have known each other since I got caught in the rain with Joanne Harris in Manchester, and John did a Sir Walter Raleigh moment and rescued the two of us and drove us across town. I still can't believe that all the taxi drivers went off shift at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I know what happens when the pubs close, but is there something about tea time that I just missed?
Where in Glasgow?
No, this is in Manchester.
In Manchester, I don't know. I because I'm a Liverpool fan. I struggle with Manchester at the best of times. So I think a plague on all their houses, quite frankly. Yeah, it's a weird one. It's almost like they don't want to get their taxis wet. I mean, they've got a nice clean taxi. You take it out in the rain, it's going to get destroyed. So maybe you better pull away and go. Yeah, but I couldn't. I always think it's very karmic that if I was to walk by you and let you stuff her there, then down the line, a piano would have fallen on my head or something. I always think these things come back and haunt you. So, and it was very nice. I had never met Joanne Harris, so it was quite nice to make her acquaintance, And we got her a little to say hello to, but yeah, it stuck with me. Why wouldn't you? Why would you leave somebody waiting for a taxi when you've got a car around the corner? That would just be silly,
Well, you're very gallant. I loved it. And I was marveling over the anti-capitalist. If I were in New York City and it started to rain, taxis like appear magically out of, the ether because they sense an opportunity to collect even more fares, whereas the British taxi drivers just sort of fled. And I've been in Japanese taxis, which are amazing because they have white doilies and the drivers on the seats. They're immaculate. The drivers wear gloves. I mean, it's an experience to take a Japanese taxi, but I can't imagine any of them abandoning people in a downpour. So anyway, John and I have known each other forever, and I'm delighted that we get a chance to talk, although I miss you at the dinner table and I miss you at the bookstore.
Well, that's very sweet of you to say. Actually, I think the last time we met was maybe the second or third last event that I did. And it was one of the loveliest because I've been an admirer of John Sanford for so long. I was reading John before. Last time I was at your store, we chatted with John, and he was very kind enough to come and visit. But I remember even before I was published, when I was just trying to write, I used to read John Sanford's books, and I think I can't understand why he isn't bigger on this side of the Atlantic. In America, North America, everybody knows how good he is, and in Ireland and Britain, he just hasn't caught on. And I don't know why, because he does two things really well that are really difficult to do in crime fiction. One is that he writes action very well. Yeah. It's very difficult to write action because it seems to go against show, not tell, if you know what I mean. And the other thing is that he's funny. One of the things I learned from John Sanford was that, you need that humor to leaven whatever you're doing. If you're going to write quite dark novels, there has to be that little light that comes in. And he's just this master of dialogue, whether it's the Virgil Flowers books or the Lucas Davenport books. So I really learned an awful lot from him. So I was very, very grateful the last time I was in Phoenix for the opportunity to finally meet him. That we'd never had a chance to meet. And he was lovely. He was what an extraordinary gentleman he was.
He is a lovely guy. Unfortunately, now that he lives in New Mexico, he frequently drives to Scottsdale to do what he calls a little light Mercedes shopping, but embracing other things. So we get to see him.
Maybe he's building a collection, a vision of a garage filled with cars, with Ferraris that Lucas Davenport has bought.
Well, it was about a month ago. My cell phone rang, and this voice that I know well said, "Barbara," he said, "we're here in town to do." His wife has taken up serious Arabian horses, and also she was here in town for things relating to Arabian horses. And he said, "Let's do dinner." And it's always a treat to spend time with John, because you absolutely never know what he's going to say about anything. I mean, he's just so well-informed and trenchant and marvelous. But anyway, this is supposed to be about you, John Connolly, not John Sanford. So let's talk about The Nameless Ones. And I want to ask you, this is a book in which we spend no time in Maine with Charlie Parker. We have a little time in New York with Lewis and Angel, but mostly we're in Amsterdam, moving on to Vienna, and then spending a lot of time in Eastern Europe. And this is your 19th Charlie Parker, right?
Yeah, 19 in that universe, I suppose, of books. So I think it is. I'm not being false or anything when I say I've lost count a little bit.
Well, I'm keeping track of, anniversary things. Next year is the 20th, so we'll have to do something, spectacular. But the other thing that's interesting, although this is, ostensibly a Charlie Parker story, Charlie isn't actually in it all that much. Charlie's there. But this is really, there are a lot of players in this book. It's a very complicated book. But Lewis and Angel, and then these two evil Serbian gangster brothers are really the main players, not to mention the crooked Viennese lawyer and a very strange woman. So, what can I say? What interested you in the whole Serbo-Croatian? I've traveled in Croatia, and also spent time in Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. We did a trip down and up the Danube and spent a fair amount of time there. And it's beautiful country, but it's ethnically very mixed. One of the things we learned was, for example, in Bulgaria, also true in the Ukraine, loads of Germans were brought in the 19th century to farm. And so, it made it really complicated in the two world wars, because, where did their loyalties lie?
Well, I think there was always a tension between what was, I think, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Serbian Empire. What I hadn't realized when I went over was, Serbia was this massive imperial power. And I think that's one of the ongoing problems, in that there is a section of Serbian society that would like to see Serbia restored to that kind of greatness again. I love globe-trotting thrillers, though. No, I wouldn't say, not even a guilty pleasure. I just think I don't really believe in guilty pleasures, apart from maybe touching farm animals inappropriate or whatever it might be. But I don't think when it comes to books, we should have any guilty pleasures. But I love those globe-trotting thrillers, those thrillers that move very quickly from one country to another. You get these changes of scenery and atmosphere, and I'd never written one. And it didn't suit Parker. Those books don't quite work in that way for him, although the Book of Bones did a little bit of that. And I suppose, we in Europe at the moment are looking at Serbia applying to join the European Union. And there is a kind of constant bubbling of resentments and feuds and the aftermath of this conflict that happened at the end of the last century, after the fragmentation of Yugoslavia. And so I was very interested in that conflict and in the reverberations from it. And I thought that, on a very kind of slightly glib level, you're always looking for a good villain. And it's unfortunate that the Serbians don't have many people on their side. And so I thought, if I was going to pick a villain, I may as well try and use some of the aftermath of this conflict. And it's a slightly difficult one. I was having a discussion with a journalist recently, and he said, isn't it strange that you write these books, these violent novels that, you're putting them in front of a public. And I had to point out that actually people are being entertained by violence. You know, that when a writer is writing these books that get your heart racing, that keep you turning the pages on an airplane, the reader is colluding in this a little bit. And when you begin using a real conflict, and one that really was appalling on every level, you do have to be quite careful. And yet you don't want to be pulling up a soapbox and giving people a lecture about what happened in Serbia. You know, for those who don't know, Tito, who was the Serbian dictator, essentially held together a whole lot of different ethnic groups that really didn't get on at all. And Tito's view was simply that, look, I don't care if you don't get on with each other. You're going to do it because I tell you to do it. And anybody who doesn't do it will answer to me. And when Tito died and the Iron Curtain began to fall and the Berlin Wall came down, all of these groups that had been kept in play or in check by Tito's presence really began preparing for the breakup of Yugoslavia, and this descended into conflict. And eventually NATO became involved, and the US was persuaded to bomb the Serbs, who they're still very resentful about this. And those conflicts haven't gone away. There's still a lot of tension between these countries, and now a lot of them are trying to join the European Union, and we're going to have to deal with some of these tensions. And so it was a very interesting backdrop, I thought, for a novel. And yet the novel doesn't include any descriptions of, you know, atrocities in camps. It's quite careful about how it uses them.
No, you don't. Although you do put in a lot of really horrendous statistics. You know, I mean, that's the way that you chose, I think, to underline the enormous tragedies of, you know, I mean, virtual. It was awful. Really awful. It gave me a lot more respect for Tito, whatever his methods, that he managed to hold it together. Also made me realize how incredibly tribal all of it is, which actually turned out to be true of Czechoslovakia, not broken up. And, you know, Poland is now, you know, sort of misbehaving as far as the European Union is going. And, you know, I was hoping that a lot of this tribalism had been eradicated, but it hasn't. And what you said about Serbia, I think, is really true about Russia and Putin. They've never quite gotten over, you know, he has not gotten over losing the, you know, the size and the power base and so forth. And he's up to mischief in that part of the world as well. One of the things I noticed when I arrived in Belgrade was the you can buy Serbian national football shirts, soccer shirts with Putin's name and number on the back of it. You know, that he is very anxious to maintain influence in that part of the country. But, you know, on the other hand, having said all that, the people are extraordinary. One of the drivers I had, he came up with the best summary of what has happened. He said, you know, an awful lot of bad things happened. And he said, we were responsible for most of them. And he emphasized most of them. There is a lingering sense of injustice. At the same time, it's beautiful. There are very few Western tourists. Most of the street signs you've been, they're not really, a lot of them are still using the Cyrillic alphabet. And what I was interested in was there is an ethnic group called the Vlach, right?
And they're kind of related to the Romani culture, and they have this extraordinary, almost an ancestor worship tied in with Christianity, and they're regarded as the last great source of witchcraft in Eastern Europe. And when I hear something like the last great source of witchcraft in Eastern Europe, my eyes light up. I think this sounds fantastic, you know? And so that fed into the book. But the difficulty is I wanted to find some Vlach witches. I wanted to find somebody who knew about that part of Vlach culture. And so I had hired a driver and he said, what are we going to do? Because usually he takes people around a couple of old forts and they go to a market, they buy some wine and they go back to Belgrade. And I said, we're actually going to look for witches. I'd like to find some Vlach witches. And he kind of shrugged his shoulders and thought, put me in the back of this lovely Audi. And we drove to what is supposed to be the heart of the Vlach country. And the really difficult thing now about witches is that, and coming into Halloween, is that unfortunately, they don't really dress like witches. You don't arrive in a place and it looks like the start of a Hammer horror film, you know, with the bell and an old inn. And the guy said, well, I wouldn't walk around after dark. And there are people in long kind of black hats. You know, witches don't really look like witches anymore, you know, like the good old days. And it's actually quite, you arrive in this one is quite a perfectly nice market town. And you can't really tap people on the shoulder and say, are you a witch, or do you know anybody who might be? It's going to cause unrest. And it was lucky we ended up in a museum to kill time, because I just thought this is not going to work. I should have just stayed in Belgrade. And there's a lovely little museum in this town, and the woman came out to open it, and she only spoke Swedish and Serbian. So I don't speak either of those, but thankfully the driver spoke some English and a little bit of Serbian. And she asked us what we were doing. She gave us a tour of the museum, and we said we were looking for Vlach, people from the Vlach culture who might take the time to chat. And she said, well, actually, the guy put in my kitchen, he's Vlach. And lo and behold, she locked up the museum, and she made a call, and she got in the car, and she bought some sweets to give to his kids, and we drove to this little village. And this lovely, lovely man came and just chatted with me for a few hours in the square of this village. It was freezing cold. The village had, I think it had 600 houses and maybe 400 inhabitants, because most people had left. And he was just very open about this fantastic culture. They build these extraordinary tombs because they believe that after somebody dies, they spend years on earth before they make the transfer to the next world. And so they want them to be comfortable. So there'll be a couch and maybe a TV and a rug, and you build them big because at some point down the line, you're going to be in there too, and you might want to have those kind of comforts. And so he was just, one of the things I love about writing and traveling to these places, I think people are interested. I think every life, if you examine it closely enough, is interesting. If you take the time to talk to somebody, they will tell you extraordinary things, because everybody's life has these little moments. And so one of the real pleasures, to go back to your original question, why did I do it, was because I hadn't been there and I hadn't talked to these people. And I wanted to explore a culture that seemed so different and so extraordinarily rich. And that added texture to the book. The best parts of the book probably come from those conversations in Vienna. And the other thing, and just coincidence, because I went there, and I think probably in 2019. And I had a vague idea for the book. People often ask you, am I a planner? And I'm not. I'm no good at planning. I don't like playing chess. I can't think that far ahead. But I had a vague idea that I wanted to write about a lot of the things I've spoken to you about. And I had some scenes in my head, and I was going to do this trip to Serbia. And I met a man named Robert Pym. And Robert writes under the name Robert Pym, but actually his real name is Lee Turner. And he was the British ambassador in Vienna. And so we did an interview. And Lee said, if you have time, he said, you should visit the cemetery of the Nameless Ones. He said it's because originally the flow of the Danube used to take in, if people's bodies, if people took their own lives, or if they were attacked and thrown in the river, the flow of the Danube would bring them all to land in a particular place. And quite often they wouldn't be identified because they had been in the water for a while. And the local fishermen created a cemetery, and they would bring these people onto the land and they would bury them, and they would put a little cross above them. And every once a year, there is a little cemetery ceremony for the people who are buried in the cemetery of the Nameless Ones. And it's in the most unprepossessing part of Vienna. I had to take a tram, and then I had to take the subway, and then a tram, and then I had to get on a bus, and then I had to walk. And I ended up at the back of this industrial estate, and in it is this little cemetery. And yet that moment brought the whole book together. It gave the book its title. It gave it its central scene, which is a confrontation between two lawyers. And all of that was from somebody saying to me in the course of a conversation, maybe this is somewhere you'd like to visit. And that's sometimes how books are put together. You maybe will have 5 fruitless expeditions, but the 6th expedition will bring everything together. And I guess you have to be open to those chances, to those possibilities. So it was just good fortune that I met Lee, and he said, do you want, instead of going to visit, to look at white Viennese horses or more Dürer sketches, go to a godforsaken cemetery at the back of an industrial estate. And it worked. That gave the book its title.
It did, absolutely. One of the things I found fascinating that you were exploring in this, and you do it with I'm sure how to pronounce it, Diager, whatever his name is, Jager.
De Jager, I think.
Diager. Okay, it's Dutch. But anyway, there's a scene very early on in the book on page 10 where this guy is mulling over his own life and career. And, you say he was also, it had to be admitted, a criminal by action, nature, inclination, and association. But he had always behaved with honor in his dealings with his own kind, because there was nothing worse than a felon who could not be trusted, and even malefactors require a code of conduct. So you do that with him. Then we have the two Serbian brothers and their views of the world and why they behave. One in particular, the badder one in one sense, but maybe not in another. And then when we meet the lawyer, the crooked lawyer in Vienna, you do a whole lot about how he has rationalized his association with all of these. And you talk about it. And I really loved what you said. Anton Friend, like all gamblers, was in love with risk. And men who became besotted with hazard also grow accustomed to it. In this, it resembles other vices. The practice becomes habitual. And what is habitual inevitably becomes dull, thereby requiring greater extremes of behavior in return for rewards that will at best plateau. For Friend, this behavior manifested itself as an ongoing immersion in criminal society. And so he resembled a man wading deeper and deeper into colder and colder waters, gradually losing all feeling in his limbs and numbing his senses on the way to an inevitable drowning, which really you foreshadow what happens to him in this book. I'm sorry if that's a spoiler, but bad things do happen to bad people. And so I was interested that, and then we've always had to deal with Lewis and Angel and, and their code. Why were you so interested in exploring the sort of inner conscious moral workings of these characters?
Because I want the reader to kind of sympathize with them. And it's very hard to do that even with the worst of them. I may not have succeeded because it may be on some level what they're doing is so appalling. But these men become trapped. Essentially, they commit a crime, and their main aim is to get back to Serbia, because once they're in Serbia, nobody can touch them. And then they find themselves marooned outside Serbia because events happen in Serbia that take away that possibility temporarily. So they're trying to work through this lawyer. And yet every time an avenue is cut off from them, they try to find another one. They're like rats moving through a maze. And I quite admire their tenacity. Even Friend wants to survive, and he tries to find ways to survive. And if it's just a question of the reader siding with Angel and Louis against these people, the book only has one direction. It becomes uninteresting to me. And so to explore the psychology of these characters, to try and have the reader at least understand what they're doing, puts the readers that little bit closer to them. The readers invest a little bit in them, I think. And that was my hope. But like I said, it may not have worked. It may
No, I didn't say it didn't work. I thought it was really fascinating. And when you consider that all of this stems from the fact that Lewis himself actually killed somebody, which enraged one of the Serbian brothers because he wanted his own chance at revenge, and Lewis took it away from him by killing the guy. And that
Louis and Angel are not good either. There are gradations of badness going on here, and so I think somebody described the morality of the book, which is a lovely word, as bracing, which I think was a lovely way of describing it. Because yes, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that idea of readers being entertained by what is essentially violence and taking sides with people who may not be worth taking sides with. Louis' morality is entirely black and white. And there's nothing really to write home about. And he sets out essentially, as you say, Louis took a job years before that involved killing a man. And from that one act, everything awful that happens in the book comes, and so he bears some responsibility for what has happened, and yet he never really looks at it that way. Louis just thinks, I'm going to set out and I'm going to kill each of these people, and he does it when the opportunity arises. He does it without any hesitation, with no compunction, and in ways that there's no particular honor to him. He views it simply as a matter of eradicating these people. And so, I kind of want them, you kind of hope that the reader at some point pauses and thinks, is it right that I'm cheering this kind of behavior on? Is that, is what Louis is doing any better than what these men have done before him? And so you can play games with the reader a little bit. And because Parker isn't there, Parker is much more likely to question these situations. Parker has more doubts about what he does and the legitimacy of it. And so when you're confronted with Angel Louis, you don't have Parker as a mediating presence. You don't have Parker wondering if this is the right thing to do. And so that was interesting to me, to remove Parker from the equation entirely and leave the reader to make a lot of these decisions and to question if the reader chooses to question it at all.
Well, I've always thought it was amusing that, while Charlie Parker is a private eye, and so, the uninitiated might think that if you're reading a Charlie Parker novel, it's a private eye investigation. They're not, they're thrillers. They really are thrillers. And as you point out, you have to have a really worthy villain to make a thriller work. If you have a bland villain and a not bad villain, then, we don't go anywhere. But you also have other characters who, on the range of badness, are less violent. So one of the other triggers in this book is a woman who says Armitage, is that her name? I think it is, who makes the phone call and sort of gets it all in motion. So what is her job? She actually is a government official.
Yeah, she turned up in a book of bones that she was essentially a compromised government official. She was a legate, the FBI representative, essentially, in this
What's
country.
a legate? L-E-G-A-T.
A legate is, as far as I understand it, it's complicated. The FBI is not permitted to involve itself in its jurisdiction is the United States.
Right.
And yet occasionally situations would arise in foreign countries that involve US nationals. It may be one of them may be attacked, one of them may be killed. And in that case, the legate is essentially the FBI person, part of the FBI mission in these embassies. There is usually a legate attached to the embassy, and that is the FBI representative, as far as I understand it. So there are people who are responsible for investigating perhaps crimes that happen to US citizens abroad. They can become involved in that case, and so that's what she is. And it turns out in the Book of Bones, it's made clear very early on that she has been compromised, and it turns out in this book that she has been compromised by the Buksans, the Serbian gangsters who are at the heart of this book. I've always, one of the difficulties I had with crime fiction as opposed to other forms of genre fiction was that quite often characters didn't have any memory, and books were too discrete, that Parker or A.N. other, they wouldn't remember that, just last year he was involved in this, enormous case that had all these ramifications, all these people died. And in the Parker books, people have memories. And something that happens in book 15 may only, suddenly become relevant to the reader 4 books later. And I'll remind the reader about it, and I'll remind new readers about it. But I always wanted to create a series of books that were interlinked, that had a kind of overarching narrative. And so that one book would feed into another. And I hope that for some readers, that's the pleasure of it. But I also think that some readers don't like that. I think it was Lee Child who said that, Jack Reacher shouldn't have a memory, that he thought that it would put off readers. And yet, if you read historical fiction, if you read science fiction, if you read fantasy fiction, those books are predicated on you having a memory. Part of the pleasure of, and the characters having memory, part of the pleasure of Bernard Cornwell Sharp novels, for example, is this accumulation of history that the characters have. And, Cornwell will remind you about it. And the reader...
we just got in a shipment of Bernard Cornwell's new. He's gone back to Sharp now.
He's gone back to Sharp, which I'm delighted about. He was the first writer who ever wrote me a nice letter when I was published.
Oh.
We've never met, but when Every Dead Thing was published, I received a letter through my publishers from Bernard Cornwell saying how much he had enjoyed the book. And there were one or two others in the interim, and it was quite lovely. And then he sent me a copy of one of his books signed, which is on my shelf. And it's funny because it's odd being in Ireland, and while I have obviously a base in Maine, I haven't been there for a couple of years, and I tend just to go over to write. You don't really cross paths with people quite as much. And so there have been these, like I said to you earlier, when we were talking about John Sandford, the pleasure of meeting John Sandford at last, having read him and admired him for so long. And Bernard Cornwell is another writer that I've read and admired. I like the way that he's constructed the Sharp series. I like the way that he relies on the reader's memory. He assumes the reader is intelligent. Dumb people don't read books. We don't really have to worry too much about the intelligence of readers. We should always assume that the reader is intelligent and go, well, look, actually here, maybe you're going to have to work a little bit. Maybe I'm going to bring in a character from a little while ago, but I'll tell you about that character. I'll remind you of who they were. You're not going to be completely lost. But if you do that, a series becomes richer. I've always wanted to experiment with the series, the possibilities of the series. And also at the same time, I realize, and this is just talking about me, and I'm not passing judgment on anybody else. I find it very hard to develop just within the confines of a series as a writer. I find it very difficult. And so I've always, every book or two, I take a step away from the Parker books and I write something else. And that's in an effort to develop a new skill and improve as a writer. And then I can come back to the Parker books and I can go, well, okay, I've learned this. I can take the books in this direction, or I can apply what I've learned. And hopefully the Parker books will improve along the way. I remember having, I think next week I'll be talking to somebody from Otto's bookstore. From Otto's bookstore. You remember Otto Pensler? He's a young man entering the trade. We have high hopes for him in his store. But I remember Otto saying that one of the mistakes he thought I'd made in my career was that I hadn't stuck with mystery writing, that I hadn't stuck with the series, and I'd gone off and done other things. And he said that readers didn't like it. And I can understand why readers get frustrated sometimes. Readers often want writers to keep producing the character that they enjoy because they get pleasure out of the books. And that's a lovely thing for a writer to be able to do. But I think it becomes very hard over a period of time for a writer to sustain freshness just by writing a series.
Well, you'll be happy to know that Mr. Sandford is producing a novel for the spring about Letty. It is not
about who?
Letty. She is the adopted daughter of Lucas Davenport.
Of course. Okay.
And so, Virgil was a step away from Lucas. Yeah. I love Virgil, and Letty is a different character. And I don't agree with Otto. I do think if you're talking just about building a brand and you want people, it depends on what your goal is.
Yeah.
If your goal is to develop as a writer, then I do think that most writers, I will never forget Michael Connolly sitting down and looking at me after his fourth book, because we've done every book with Michael. We did his first ever book event. And he said to me, Harry's done 4 books that had some personal connection, because the last one was he was investigating the murder of his own mother. And he said, it's time for Harry to catch a case just because he's a cop. But in the meantime, Michael also decided to write the poet, to leave Harry and go off and do something else in order to.
But that's interesting. But I want to be very clear that I'm not pointing the finger at anybody else.
No,
But for me, even if you I had something of the same thing. After I wrote my first 4 books, I then wrote a book called Bad Men. But even within that, although Parker very briefly turns up in kind of just a cameo, the register in which I was writing was the same. In that, even though I had stepped away from a character, because I was still working within the confines of a particular genre, there wasn't that room for maneuver. There wasn't that scope for exploration. And for me, they have to be quite radical steps away from it. I'm a huge I love John le Carré. I have Silverview on my shelf now because I'm looking forward to reading it. But it would be very hard to say that the register of those novels changed dramatically. When you picked up a John le Carré novel, even though he was moving sometimes in different areas, the Constant Gardener wasn't dealing with the Cold War. The Constant Gardener was dealing with the actions of pharmaceutical companies. You were always recognizably reading stylistically a John le Carré novel. And then maybe the only one you could have an argument about might be a Perfect Spy, which was the book about his father and really didn't really have very much to do with espionage or the Cold War or whatever it might be. But the register was consistently his. I sometimes feel the same way about some writers are like that. If you pick up a John Banville book, whether Banville's writing a crime novel or not, it reads recognizably like a John Banville book. The register, again, doesn't change very much. And I suppose I worried about that with my own work. I thought I didn't want to do that. I wanted, at some point, to produce novels where you could put three of them side by side and they wouldn't read like they were read. They were written by the same person. I think it would be hard to put the Stan Laurel book, beside the Parker books and say that they came from the same, stylistically, they're very, very different. Yeah. But the skill learned from writing He then came back to be applied to the Parker books. I learned about different ways of using dialogue, white space, giving the reader more room to breathe. When I wrote The Dirty South, which was the book before this one, I had to go back and read sections of Every Dead Thing, which I hadn't looked at in 20 years. And that book now seems very dense and mannered to me. I mean, I think it's, for a book written by somebody 25 to 29, I hope it stands up. But I could see by the time I'd written The Dirty South and a lot of the extraneous prose had been cut away. Those books, Every Dead Thing probably used 10 words where 2 would have done at times. But it's picking the right 2 words, I suppose. It's interesting. It's just that I've been having these, you're often, whenever you deliver a book, I've just delivered the book for next year, which is kind of slightly different. It's 2 short Parker novels in one book, but they're kind of linked. And as soon as you do that, the first question you're asked, what are you doing next? You don't get a moment, your editor wants to know what's coming next. And I kind of know I know that I want to step away from the Parker books. I know that I need to do something different, that I need to try and stretch those muscles again. But as you say, it's a good point that you make. Do you want to be really, really successful and have a yacht? Or do you want to become a better writer? And sometimes those 2 aims are mutually incompatible. That the things that make you a better writer are probably the things that aren't going to sell quite as well and are maybe going to annoy a section of your readership, not all of your readership, but maybe a section of your readership who would prefer you to remain on the path that gives them pleasure. And that's a perfectly understandable reaction from a reader, And I think that's why, in general, I've tried to produce a Parker book novel every year. And every 2 or 3 years, add on a novel that's slightly different or a work that's...
I don't think that readers are going to give up on Charlie Parker if you write He. They may not read He.
No, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, they won't read. Not everybody will read.
Yeah, it doesn't mean... it'll be interesting to see with Sharpe's Assassin, the new Bernard Cornwell. It's been... I can't remember. I think he wrote 9. I might have this number wrong, but anyway, at least 9 books of the Saxon Chronicles. And because there was television and so forth, that paid for him to do that. And now it's been a long time since he wrote a Sharpe. They are similar in lots of ways. We're Napoleonic era, the Napoleonic War, Sharpe's fighting largely in Spain and the peninsula and so forth against Napoleon. And then Uhtred is way back, in Saxon times, but in many ways not that different. But I'll be interested to see whether readers come back to Sharpe after such a long gap, or whether it'll be a slower sell.
I think there's that residual affection, and you're right. They are similar, they're tonally similar. But to go back to le Carré, for example, I was thinking le Carré just had one theme that interested it, and that was betrayal. Every one of le Carré's novels comes back to betrayal. And quite often, he will set personal betrayals against a backdrop that's much larger. So my favorite Le Carre novel is Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I love that novel. I think it's an extraordinary piece of work. Without giving anything away, it's about the hunt for a traitor, a mole within the British Secret Service. And it turns out that, it becomes clear that the mole is also most likely the person who's having an affair with Smiley's wife. And what's suggested is actually not that the kind of person who will betray his country will also betray his friend by sleeping with his wife, but actually the kind of person who will betray his friend by sleeping with his wife is also likely to betray his country. That they begin with small betrayals. And even A Perfect Spy, that book about his father, is about an act of betrayal. It's about a father not being a father. It's about a father.
Well, but that's exactly what you point out about the lawyer, that because he's addicted to risk and so forth, he starts out small and then, being
it becomes an accumulation.
It gets into it more. You've got two characters in American government early on, and they obviously have mixed loyalties, and one of them decides to help Lewis with his quest and turn over some material. And, nobody's happy about Armitage, the legate, having done a betrayal, but the impulse is to cover it up rather than reveal it, because then everybody looks bad. And you realize the whole Chinese concept of saving face really applies to everybody in government, as far as I can work out. Certainly what we see with Trump. I mean, it's just like, a comedic expansion, or tragic, depending on how you want to look at it, of that whole idea of saving face. He can't admit that he lost the election. It has to be because it was rigged, because it was fake, because it couldn't possibly be about him, because then he would lose face, right? And in a minor way, that's what you see going on. Even one of the Yugoslav brothers, it's partly because, the Serbian brother, is partly because he wanted to wreak revenge himself, but also partly it's a loss of face. So there's a constant rolling set of betrayals in this book.
Male vanity. The book is driven by male vanity.
Oh, but there are women involved who are bad too.
Yeah, but I think the men in this book are particularly vain.
Well, they are.
As I've been talking about, as I wonder, I know I kept harping on Le Carre, but I suppose because I'm such a Marnie dog. But actually, I realized this book was very influenced by the Le Carre books I've read.
Yeah.
So I loved those exchanges between shadowy men, who are having these discussions, and it's quite sordid and minor. It's about how much can you give away, what can you sacrifice, and people become pawns in it. This we can sacrifice these people for what we see as a greater good. And I've always wanted to write. I love spy novels.
Yes,
I love Robert
platonic,
Littell.
It really is platonic. Who will govern the governors? That question has come along all the way, and so who gets to decide who gets to save face, and whether that is, better for anybody or not. So tell us a little bit about Zorya. I don't want to do any spoilers, but you always liked, well, not always, but you do like supernatural elements in your book. You like to thin the borders between the real and the not real, between life and death and so forth. So we have Zorya and a very dramatic scene at the end. So what can you say about Zorya that won't be a spoiler?
Zorya appears to be a child. She appears to be a child, and it's only when you get up close to her that you realize you're not actually looking at a child. You're looking at, her skin is old. It's only superficially she's young, and there's a suggestion that she's been around for a very long time.
Right. Why does she have scoliosis?
Well, that kind of I don't want to give away the ending, but
no.
that there's a reason there, because it actually becomes a kind of identifier, and so there are ways around that. But I found her. I should say I'm still fascinated by that mixing of genres. Obviously we're talking about Nameless Ones, but one of the book that's coming out here on this side of the Atlantic is a long study of genre fiction, because I'm fascinated by genre fiction, and I think for a long time we were much more comfortable with mixing genres than we are now. Those 19th century writers, a lot of them were writing mystery fiction alongside horror stories, alongside ghost stories. And there was some intermingling. I was writing about Sheridan Le Fanu, who was this wonderful Irish writer who wrote The House by the Churchyard and Uncle Silas. And Uncle Silas is a really interesting book. Uncle Silas is one of the earliest attempts to mix the supernatural and the crime novel. And he's very consciously doing it. And when he wrote his introduction to it, you can see him defending it. Long before I was having these arguments with people, Le Fanu was aware that there is a tension here between the rational world and the anti-rational. And I think it's interesting that he's an Irish writer. Irish writers are much more comfortable with mixing those two things than I think perhaps British writers or very particularly American writers are. I think we've always been comfortable at holding two completely contrary opinions in our heads at the same time. I think it's an aspect of our genius, I like to think. But from a very early stage, Irish writers were interested in mixing the two. One of the stories in the anthology is by a writer named L.T. Mead. And it's about a character that she created called the Sorceress of the Strand. And this is a character who appears to be superficially to be a businesswoman. But it's clear that, she's older and stranger than that. And so in the 19th century, we were very comfortable with that mixing of genres. And then in the 20th century, it kind of falls away a little bit. And there aren't that many people doing it. James Lee Burke does it a little bit, but, Burke is a Catholic writer. And in Irish, Burke is very conscious of his Irish ancestry. The only other book I can think of that does it is William Hjortsberg's Falling Angel, that became the basis for Angel Heart. That's a very interesting attempt to mix genres, to mix the private eye novel with something far stranger. And so I've always been fascinated by it. If I try to write a straight novel, it doesn't come out that way. If you handed me a metal skewer, I'd hand it back to you as a corkscrew. That's just the nature of it. I am curious about how you can mix genre, how you can do it and still not alienate readers, and make them feel that this could happen. There is a possibility here, and to have them go along with it.
Well, the actual villain here to a great degree is marketing. It was the rise of Barnes and Noble and now Amazon, and, assigning tags so that people, can stick to a genre. I mean, we've achieved something like tribalism in reading. But, I think that readers are manipulated by it. One of our protests at the Poison Pen is not to do that. We simply, have a giant shelving thing called fiction. Mm-hmm. And we don't bother very often to try to dice it up because we think that it makes for more interesting exploration if people just wander down the shelf. And,
I agree with you. It's quite a random thing how we assign books to genre. Some writers choose to identify themselves that way. I mean, I'm quite happy to say that the Parker books are mystery novels. I just have a wider conception of mystery. In Ireland, there were just far more difficulties. There was for a long time much clearer line of demarcation between what was considered literary fiction and what was considered genre fiction. For most of the 20th century in Ireland, we produced very little genre fiction at home. Most of the Irish genre writers leave Ireland to go and write. There isn't a welcome for it here, and there are lots of historical reasons for that. And so I suppose I'm quite conscious of it here, that you often have to argue your case in Ireland a little bit more. And there's a much greater reluctance to just frame things as fiction. There is fiction, and then there's other stuff. I've never been comfortable with that.
I think there's a lot of mashup in the science fiction and fantasy world. They seem to be more comfortable. You can have a detective, you can have all kinds of different people operating in that universe, and nobody seems to mind. Patrick, why don't we call you up into this discussion since we're coming up on the hour anyway? What would you like to contribute to that?
Well, I was unaware of this book, John, of your anthology. And while you were talking, I was looking it up. And
good.
We need to get, I guess, did you sign some at Goldsboro and some other places in the UK?
Yeah, I think the entire first print one was signed because it's just still too difficult to do events. So it just
gorgeous cover too. Barbara, we got to get on that one.
Well, stick it into the system and I'll send an order in. I
will.
wasn't aware of it either. So
Yeah.
it's a
Oh, sorry, I
surprise.
didn't mean to. Sorry, because I know I'm supposed to be talking about Nameless Ones, but it just arose naturally in the context of what we were talking about in
No,
terms of
it's fine.
genre.
I'm glad you
Gothic.
alerted us to it.
I love Le Fanu, and and Stoker, of course, was Irish, wasn't he?
Yeah, we produced, Oscar
Oscar
Wilde,
Wilde
Stoker,
was
Charles
Irish.
Maturin. Yeah, C.S. Lewis. We forget that C.S. Lewis was Irish.
Narnia. Yeah.
Yeah, Narnia. Our Irish writers have been very influential in genre fiction for a very long time. So
Would something
I
like
kind of wanted to acknowledge that.
would something like James Stevens' Crock of
Yeah,
Gold?
the Crock of Gold. Yeah, well, look at you. You're really impressive. Yeah, that's a niche one. And there are, we wrote love stories, we wrote women's popular fiction, we wrote detective fiction, we wrote, L.T. Mead essentially creates the medical mystery. Doesn't really exist. An Irish writer, lovely, whatever knew her, but a woman named Mary Helen of Fortune becomes the first woman writer to write first person police narratives. And is so good at it that people just assume they're being written by a policeman. Irish writers were very interested from the beginning in experimentation. They looked at genre, they looked at fiction and thought, we can do all kinds of interesting things with this. And a lot of them were women. And because of the nature of the way we talk about Irish fiction, a lot of those women were excluded from the conversation in the 20th century. They were just simply excised from Irish history, from Irish literary history. They weren't referred to. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do with Shadow Voices, and a lot of things I'm trying to do, is to restore these women's voices to that literary history. And they were excluded because they were women and because they were genre writers. And the two things often went hand in hand. I think women were often much more aware of not just the commercial possibilities, but the creative possibilities of genre fiction. And so when in Ireland we excluded genre fiction from the discussion in the 20th century, we also excluded an awful lot of our women writers. And so that was an injustice and imbalance that I felt needed to be addressed.
Fantastic. Well, we've got a lot of questions here. Let me just run through. We're not going to have time for all of them, but some great. You have wonderful fans, John. I mean, some great.
They are nice people. I do have nice fans.
Yeah, there might be a couple of scary ones in here, but
didn't say that they weren't scary. Just that they were nice.
One of them just makes the comment, John, the amount of human skulls you have in your house is starting to concern me.
You've got a skull behind you. Why am I being singled out? Yeah, that's true. Bert and Ernie.
It's true. Yes.
On the side here.
Yes.
I know, but they're not in every room. People don't come in and kind of go, oh my God, look at that pile of skulls in the hallway. What is this guy doing? I have a couple in the office.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Do you always know from the very beginning how the book will end, or do you decide while you write the novel as the story develops?
I about 2/3 of the way through, I'll know how it's going to end. The only times that didn't happen were with the Dirty South. I always knew how the Dirty South was going to end. I think that's the first time that it happened. Certainly in my mystery novels. It didn't help because then suddenly I had to find a way to get everybody to that point. And the other thing was he from the beginning, before I set pen to paper, I knew what the last line of he would be, and that never changed. But mostly part of the pleasure in writing for me is discovering the book as I go along. So the experience of the first draft for me is very similar to the reader's first experience of reading it. I like to find it's a very slow way of writing, and you're persecuted by doubt, because I think it's much easier if you can write with a plan. Those moments of doubt are less consistent and prevalent, but I've just never been able to write that way. And I think if I knew how a book unfolded from beginning to end, I wouldn't want to write it. It wouldn't interest me. I'd be bored before I started, I think.
Are you an obsessive rewriter? How many drafts do you do?
Yeah, I am. I do an awful lot. And they're start to finish drafts. I don't go dipping in and out. I write from beginning to end, and I go over it again and again and again. And I think I find that each book has its own rhythm. And you discover the rhythm of the book through rewriting it. And you become aware of the places where the rhythm is off, or where there's like rocky ground. And if I'm having difficulty with it when I'm doing my rewrites, the reader will have difficulty when they're reading it. So it becomes a way of smoothing out those little rough parts and finding the rhythm of the book.
I'm going to kind of put together a couple of questions. And this is, I think that the person's name is Lut or Lut, L-U-T, but he or she has a lot of great comments. A villain is not just a villain in John Connolly books. They haunt us, and we are fascinated by them as much as we are fascinated by the protagonist. Let's see, villains are also in-depth characters. Do you do research about these villains? Where do you get the inspiration from? How do you come up with these extraordinary villains?
They're real. I don't do any research into villainy at all. It largely doesn't interest me in that way. These are creatures from the id. The villains often arrive fully formed in the books, and I even Luke makes a very good point. I try not to think of them as villains. Particularly in this book, the Vuxans and the lawyer friend don't consider themselves to be villainous people. They're pragmatists. They consider themselves to be pragmatists, and they're acting in that way. And I don't believe in the concept of minor characters. I've always been fascinated by Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is, if you don't know, is this fantastic play in which the focus is shifted from Hamlet onto these two minor characters in the play who arrive. They're supposed to kill Hamlet. They actually die off the page. We don't even see their deaths. They're completely inconsequential. And Stoppard just shifts the focus of the play away from Hamlet and onto them. And what he suggests is actually, we are all the major players in our own universe. We are all at the center of our own universe. And so, you could shift the focus of the Nameless Ones onto Friend, and it would be his novel. And he would become the focus of it, and he would become the character. And I want readers to invest in them. I want readers to feel involved in what happens to them, because otherwise the book doesn't have any purpose. These are become throwaway characters. But the villainous ones arrive fully formed, essentially fully formed. I realize they're in my head somewhere, and maybe you could argue that there's a very good Irish writer named Brian McGilloway. I think you'll know Brian. I know of his books. What I think Brian does really well is that he writes beautifully about virtue, and he makes virtue interesting. It's actually quite easy to make awful people interesting and keep the readers turning the page. It's actually much harder to write virtue and make virtue interesting, because we take virtue a little bit for granted when we probably shouldn't. And I really admire that about Brian's books. He makes the ordinary interesting.
Right. It's funny. I remember in school, I took a class on Milton. And the only reason I bring this up is that, in Paradise Lost, I remember the professor always saying, or I remember that the class was saying, the fall, the rebel angel is so much more interesting.
Yeah.
He's,
Dracula. It happens. Dracula's much more interesting than Van Helsing.
Right.
They carry us away because they're so elemental. The bad characters, are the ones that we're presenting as villains, are so elemental that they carry the reader and the writer away sometimes.
But did you think that's true of Silence of the Lambs? I mean, Hannibal Lecter is much more interesting than Clara Starling, for example.
Yeah, and as the books go on, what I love about those books is that quite clearly Harris has fallen in love with Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Lecter, because by the time you get to Hannibal, the book, it's clearly written with Anthony Hopkins' mellifluous Welsh tones in mind, that he's getting these speeches about Italy and about, the atrocity exhibition. And you can just, that Harris is hearing that voice in his head. On a different level, I think it's really interesting. We've read Colin Dexter. I think it's very interesting if you read Dexter's early Morse books. Morse he's not a particularly likable character. He's a bit seedy and sordid, and he looks at schoolgirls and he buys pornography. By the end, he's John Thaw. That Dexter has become so influenced by this portrayal, this depiction of him on screen, which does something different with the character, that comes back into the books again and alters the series as it goes along. And so, you're right. I think sometimes writers, we're open to all kinds of influences. And I think that's what's interesting when your character begins to be portrayed on screen. To what extent does the actor's interpretation of that character then feed back into the books and alter the books as a consequence? I wonder when Mike Connolly writes, I haven't seen Michael in a few years, when he writes Harry Bosch now, does he see Titus Welliver? Does Titus Welliver's interpretation of that character begin to affect the way that Michael presents the books? Because Bosch has altered, I think.
Well, actually, and interestingly, in the new one, The Dark Hours, which I have just read, it's actually the woman, Renee Ballard, who is the focal character, and Bosch is becoming a second, secondary character. She's really the thrust of the book. But, I think that was always inevitable as Harry's gotten too old, to do a lot of the stuff that he's done. And, I'm going to be interested to see what Ian Rankin does with Rebus, because gradually Siobhan and so forth are doing more of the heavy work, because Rebus, like Bosch, has aged.
Right.
It's a dilemma. We talked last night, I love this too, a gentleman where the Spencer Quinn, where the narrator is a dog. He's not a talking dog, he's a narrating dog, and he's wonderful. But a decision that had to be made early was whether the dog would age, because, dogs have such a short lifespan compared to people. And so, the tacit bargain in all this is that Chet, is going to be like forever, whatever he is, an 8-year-old dog, in order to keep it going. So, authors have to make decisions about how their characters will develop if they're taking any kind of a long view. Patrick, I'm sorry, do you have more questions? Because we are kind of running out of time.
Yeah. Are you okay for a few more minutes, John?
Sure.
We've got a bunch of questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And also, remember, Barbara, Spencer Quinn was the author, and he said he heard from readers that, if you do anything to that dog, I'll never read another word that you write.
Yes.
Yeah. And also, just to circle back for a second, one comment you made just a moment ago, John, was really interesting. And that's that, the villains don't think of themselves as villains. They don't have that kind of self-awareness. At any rate, let's see. Okay, here's a question from Ellen. And she says, you've experimented with multiple genres and things that are genre adjacent. I'm thinking of The Reapers as a Western. Will you ever write a Gothic or a romance or a pure horror novel?
Gothic, a romance or a pure horror? I don't know. How long do I have? I'm not sure. I don't seem to be able to write anything that's pure. They all seem to involve mixing genres, or they all become contaminated by something else. So I don't know, and I don't know how far ahead I am. I know what the next 2 books are, and then I have a hankering to write something that isn't a crime novel. But that's as far as I've got with it. So I don't know. But I am endlessly curious about the possibilities of genre fiction. That has never left me, and I don't feel I'm quite defensive of genre fiction. I dislike people attacking it as somehow shallow or inconsequential or restrictive, because I don't think it's restrictive. When I was writing the introduction to Shadow Voices, the point I made was that there are people who seem to think that genre fiction is like an exoskeleton, like the skeleton of a bug, that it prevents it from growing too far. You can only grow so much, and then you're stopped. But in fact, genre for me is just a kind of skeleton. You can hang anything you want on it. It's a framework. That's all it is. And then you can take it away in any direction that you choose to do. So I haven't yet exhausted the possibilities. So who knows?
Well, Lute, our friend here again says, I don't care which genre. I love John Connolly books, all of them since 1999.
Okay, get Lute's address, because that check needs to go somewhere.
That's right. Getting back to the book, The Nameless Ones, I'm not sure what the name is, but how many trips to the area did you take for research? Did you decide before putting pen to paper that you would incorporate the Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian War?
Yeah, no, that was always there from the beginning. I think if you're going to set something in that part of the world, you can't get away from it. And not just that war, but the fact that it was a continuation of earlier conflicts, that, a lot of these resentments dated back to not just the Second World War, but the First World War. And you have to be aware of that. I wanted to go back. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way, in that I had made my first research trips to Vienna and to Serbia, and I'd come back with a whole pile of notes. And what I usually do is then write the book, and then often I'll go back again and check that everything is okay. And it wasn't possible to do that this time. Travel was completely restricted. So I had to rely on the notes. And I think the notes I took were pretty good. And so I was reasonably happy to stand over what I had. But there were some things I set aside because I hadn't had a chance to check them. I hadn't had a chance to go back. There were areas that I might have traveled to, and I wasn't able to do so because COVID prevented people from going anywhere.
Right. Let's see. I'm switching over to Facebook here. Oh boy, I wonder if I can translate this one. I got a Spanish language question. This is a good challenge. Something about skulls. It says, saludos y cariño desde Mexico. Me encantan sus cráneos, which is, I love your skulls.
Goals.
Cuando regrese, when we return, okay, I give in. See translation. I love his skulls. When he returns, I'll give him an artisan skull.
Oh, great.
Right on.
Why am I gracias?
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. Okay, David asks, did you enjoy going back to read Every Dead Thing for the Dirty South?
No.
Would you revisit any others in the series?
No.
Or has it put you off?
No. God, no. It was a nightmare. It was awful. The only book I've gone back to was The Book of Lost Things. When we were doing the 10th anniversary edition of it, I gave that book a very gentle polish. But it was still very difficult to go back to, because you've moved on as a writer. You hope you've improved a little bit. And so you're looking at something that was written, I wrote, as I said to Barbara, I think I started that book when I was 26 and it was published when I was 30, and I'm now 53. There have been 33 books since then. I think I hope I've improved as a writer. Now, there are people who still say that that's my best book, and essentially that the last 20 years have just been a waste of time. I should have just stopped there, because it's been downhill ever since. No, I think it's very difficult for a writer to go back and look at work that was done a decade or 2 decades before, because all you see are the things you would change. And that way lies madness, that you would go back and begin. It would almost be impossible. It was easy enough to do with The Book of Lost Things, because that was a book that stood alone. But if you begin untangling the knots from earlier novels, and you're going to create a ripple effect that's going to affect every book afterwards. And so you have to live. The awful thing about writing is you have to live with your errors, and your errors get put, between 2 covers and are on a shelf forever. Very occasionally, if we're going to reprint, I'll change little things. But no, it was very difficult to go back. I opened it almost like, the book was going to go off in my face, like you're dealing with a bomb, because you're looking at stuff that seems to have been constructed a very long time ago, and that in an ideal world you probably wouldn't write in that way again. Were you surprised? Did part of you say, you know what, this isn't bad? I forgot. Some of it wasn't bad. Stylistically, I could see that I was completely enthralled to the writers who had influenced me. It feels very much a book written by a young man who's read an awful lot of books, which it was. And all writers are the products of the books that they read. And I think it took me 10 or 15 years just to begin to shake off those influences. To shake off the influence of Ross MacDonald, of James Lee Burke, of Sandford, and to try and find my own voice. It's a very slow process, and it's ongoing. Barbara, I got just a couple more quickies, and then we'll wrap it up, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Let's see. David says, greetings from Scotland. I have a very specific question, so I'll understand if he doesn't want to answer. Will Parker heal Angel? Will Parker? I think that's highly unlikely. I can probably answer that one. Yeah. No, I don't think that's going to happen. All right. Let's see. Will Charlie Parker's daughter have more of a role in future books? I know I know the destination of the books, and everybody who has a part to play in what's to come is on the field now. Everybody has been introduced, but I'm often very cautious about giving anything away about what's to come. So we shall see. But yes, I think she will become more one of the 2 short novels that are part of the interlinked book for next year. Actually moves the series on a few years, and so that means that Sam will be a little bit older, and that enables me to do things, or her to do things in the book that she could not otherwise have done. So yes, her part to play is being made manifest, I think. And finally, I should be a diplomat, professional diplomat. Here I am tiptoeing around. Let's see, a couple of quick final questions. This from the same person. John, how do you feel about people drawing your characters? I'm assuming, I know some authors do not like that and some do. Have you had graphic novels done of your work?
No, not of the Parker books. I know an artist has been working on one of the stories from Nocturnes, and so it's lovely to see. I have no problem with that at all. I have no problem with readers interpreting my work however they choose. I know some of them have dramatized it. I know there have been plays put on.
Really?
I think that's really wonderful. And to see people presenting their characters or their vision of the characters, or piece of artwork inspired by the books, is very touching for a writer. It's an honor. The only question I never answer is who do I, that lovely question people ask about, who do you see playing characters on screen? Never answer that question, because I still think that every reader has their own image of the character.
Yeah.
And I think if the moment a writer says, oh, it looks like X or Y or Z, at least 50% of people go, no, he doesn't. It's nothing like that. And yet you've introduced this little bug into their systems that when they open the book again, they'll be thinking, no, he doesn't. He just doesn't look like that. So I think I leave it to readers to decide how characters look. That's the only line I draw.
Well, Barbara, that's about it, I think.
Well, I would like to say two things. One of which is one of the reasons that I think John is such an engrossing writer is he's so elegant. Even if he's writing about really awful things, he's always elegant. His prose is elegant. I love his voice. And I think that's very apparent in the Nameless One. So just a comment for me about why I am.
Can I just say, can I thank you for you and Patrick and everyone at the store for now 22 years of support and friendship. It is very, very much appreciated. And I look forward to seeing you all in person again.
Well, you will, and possibly sooner than you expected, because I'm about to order Shadow Voices, which is the name of John's study of 300 years of genre fiction. But I'm going to say to you, Mr. Parker, that were I to return to Stanford University to do a doctorate, which I didn't do because I never found anything I cared enough about to pursue for 3 years, it would be genre fiction. And I have some theories about it myself. So when we get our hands on this book, let's you and I do a conversation about it. I think it'd be really
hopefully that we're looking for a US publisher for it. So hopefully it would be in person for that.
Well, that would be really nice, but we could even do it sooner because we're going to have the British book right here. As soon as I manage to end this and go to my computer and order it, it'll be on its way. Let me also remind you, Patrick has it behind you, that this wonderful book, John has prepared a signed book plate, a wonderful looking playing card, and then this fabulous book bag that is behind Patrick with Lewis and Angel, which is perfect for this book because this is really a Lewis and Angel book. Anyway, it's really a wonderful read. So congratulations, John, on completing yet another book. Thank you all very much for watching. You can encourage your friends to check us on YouTube and Facebook for the video, and there'll be a podcast available either probably tomorrow in case you missed any part of this conversation, you just want to listen to it. I have a theory which you might want to develop, that the rise in podcasts is basically a return to radio, because interacting with radio, which Patrick has done, which I certainly did as a child, is that in many ways a more rewarding experience, certainly a different experience than video. And I think that podcasts are kind of returning us to that and making it popular again. So hooray. Anyway, thanks for sticking with us, everybody. See you soon, John. Bye.
Bye-bye, folks.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, John. We can talk about what kind of dodgy music you're listening to, maybe. Take